I'm talking today with Stuart about music, mental health, autism, and the think tank with Opera North. You're an academic in the School of English and Medical Humanities with a key interest in autism. How did you go from there to music and forging a connection with Opera North?
I knew of the university's DARE partnership with Opera North in advance of any kind of contact. And I think that there was a natural inclination on my part to see how the research work I've been doing on autism might connect to non-academic communities. That was a general kind of thing. I think if you work on disability, there is a push to try and make your research relevant to non-academic partners, because there's a real world impetus, would be one way to put it. All of that may not have led to any connection were it not for the fact that I also knew through some initial contact with Opera North that there was an interest there in mental health. That all came to focus on the fact that Cheryl Frances Hode was a DARE Cultural Fellow. I found out that she had spent some time as a composer in residence at Cambridge University's psychiatry department because of her own interest in the relationship between music and mental health. So it seemed that there was just kind of, she was moving out from her core work in one direction, and I was doing something similar, and we were moving together, or towards each other rather, I think. So it seemed natural to find time and space to have an opening conversation.
Excellent. And the June 2011 think tank, it required contribution and expertise from very different groups of people. So it seems quite challenging to organise. How did you go about organising it and bringing these people together?
It's not challenging if you do think about it in terms of the fact it was a Blue Skies workshop. The point of it was to gather people with different interests and different specialisms in a room and say, what might an opera look like? So my thinking was that I was interested in, as I have been throughout my own research, I was interested in sort of not so much the question of could you make a piece of music, could you make a piece of opera which represented what autism can be or is, but I asked myself a sort of central question: what would it be like to try and think of a piece in which the whole business of being autistic, of having autism, was central? So a kind of inside out rather than outside in, because that seemed to me to be sort of a wonderfully difficult question. It's not that you can't find other things like it. There's autistic life writing, which sort of qualifies the very idea of what life writing is, because it does this inside-out approach. There are short films made by people with autism where the very idea of what constitutes a filmic narrative is changed by the cognitive difference that comes with autism. So I was thinking, well, who might we get together and ask that central question? So Cheryl was the obvious person to ask first. And then I really wanted other people, whether they were writers or directors, set designers, whatever, who would think of it as an as it were, as an interesting roundtable discussion.
Yeah.
I also wanted somebody with autism to be part of it as well, because I think that perspective is essential to sort of those kinds of developments. So that's exactly what we did. I think 5 or 6 of us just found a couple of hours in which to sit down, and I basically laid out the question as I've just laid it out to you, and we went around the room and around the houses.
Wow. On that, bringing together so many different people who would sit down at the same table, academics, musicians, autism, people with autism. And were there any benefits? Well, obviously the benefits are obvious, but were there any downsides to bringing them together? Was there difficulty in communication, or...?
There was... It wasn't really a gathering in which there was a huge amount of risk, because the worst thing that could have happened was that nothing could have come of it.
Yeah.
And that wasn't really a problem. It was not... I mean, you go into it with hopes, but you don't necessarily go into it with expectations. People naturally talk about things from their own, as it were, work perspectives. So I suppose when others first heard me, I must have sounded very academic, very kind of coming at the question from an intellectual point of view, asking questions about the very idea of an autism opera. What would the shape be? How would it be faithful to what I think I would have thought of as an idea of autistic experience? Other people would have thought, well, what would this look like on stage? Or how would I compose for this? So I think rather than problems of communication, it was just that natural process by which people come to any topic through the prism of what they do. And so we made space to listen to each other, I think would be the way to put it. I remember, for example, I had recorded some of the noises that my son makes, and I brought them into the room. And when I played them, my son can't speak, but is very vocal. And I said this, I said, listen to this. This is vocalization, which has no desire to be language, has no desire necessarily to communicate, but is nevertheless vocal expression. And Natalie Raybould, the soprano who was there, had really interesting things to say about it as sound, as vocal production, if you like, from a singer's point of view, in ways that I couldn't have come anywhere close. She talked about the way in which certain sounds were relatively easy to make, and he was avoiding making difficult sounds, for example, which completely fits, I think, with some of the ideas I have about how he makes the noises that he makes. So I think that was quite a good example of how different people lent their expertise to what we were talking about. And as I say that, because we were just seeing if anything could come of this, because there was no pressure to have a follow-up, really it was fine. And if we had just had a very interesting discussion, that would have been okay.
Excellent. That point on the vocalizations is incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I think for as I hope that example just showed in the way I described it, for that set of different reasons, it was a point about singing or not singing, but it was also a point, I think, about expression in a very wide sense. And for me, I was trying to show, well, look, this is what it sounds like. This doesn't have any pretense to be telling a story or telling a narrative. So how do we talk about something that sounds musical, that doesn't even conceive of, in as much as we can say this, in as much as we can guess that it doesn't conceive of itself as trying to be a melody, as trying to follow a pattern, as trying to express something, which we can sort of only guess at. It was quite a good moment in the room, actually, because everybody, obviously, we'd laid a load of groundwork and talked things around, and I'd kind of said what I thought would be a bad project, if you like, and posited this as a really quite difficult challenge to how we might try and think of something that was faithful to the experience of having autism, but also offered lots of potentials to make a piece of art.
Wow. Well, you didn't have any expectations, but following the session, you've been working with Cheryl, and you are thinking of developing an opera based on autistic experience. And I think I'm right in saying that Natalie, the soprano, and a set designer from the workshop are also involved. How instrumental was the think tank in instigating this project, and how's it coming along?
It was huge. Because what it left us with was the real feeling that this was both very interesting and also possible. If those people hadn't been in the room, and they include Dominic Gray from Opera North, who was very supportive, who saw it as a potential production, who saw it as something that was original, innovative, even. Nothing beats enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. And so all you need from that kind of workshop is to come out of it with a germ of an idea. And that's what we had. We had just that. We had the idea that we could try to do this inside-out type production. And what Cheryl said, she said something quite interesting. She said that she needed a scenario. She says that she couldn't just kind of create something from nothing. She needed a description, a story, somewhere to start. And what we did first of all was we thought, well, who do we know who writes, who could produce a libretto, who we could approach to get involved. And we debated various names and everything, and we came up, the first name that Dominic and Cheryl came up with was Glyn Maxwell, who I know mainly as a poet, but obviously librettist as well. And he was originally down to come to the workshop, actually, and then at the last moment couldn't. And so we spent some time just seeing if he would be part of it, if he could be part of it, but in the end his commitments meant that wasn't the case. So we were kind of stuck, and I remember I went for coffee with Cheryl, and I just said to her, I said, I can write this. I said, I can write you this scenario, because I know what I think it could look like. I know what it could be based on. I could imagine the beginning of the story, if you like. And so that seemed to be the way in. So I did that. I went away and I wrote the scenario, which was about a parent taking a child up to bed repeatedly. So not just one bedtime. The initial scenario was for 7 bedtimes, and in fact the piece that we're working to now is 14. We discussed how long would the overall piece be, and I made the point that because it's autism, because a lot to do with autism is repetition, I really liked the idea of, as it were, repeating a whole sequence of events with slight differences within the individual units, if you like. So the idea of a succession of bedtimes is good for that, because bedtime is the same thing every night. But each bedtime was slightly different. So we were working sort of backwards from about 40 minutes, 35 minutes or so for a finished piece. And I asked Cheryl, well, how long do you think you would need to be able to take something and develop it and stop it before moving on to the next one? And she said she thought you couldn't do it in less than 2 minutes or so. So all of a sudden we had our 14 2-minute segments, and it becomes like therefore a fortnight of autistic bedtimes, which is the title we're using at the moment. And I wrote the scenario, and it was I wrote it in 2 voices. I didn't intend to write it in 2 voices. I intended to write it in one voice, an internal voice of a child who cannot communicate verbally. And the moment that I'd written the first experience of a bedtime from that point of view, I almost immediately, without stopping, wrote the experience of the parent. And that was, it may sound rather grand to say it was unintentional, but it just seemed a natural thing to do, to write the parent's point of view as well. And so that emerged. What emerged was that each evening, each bedtime had these 2 voices to do with them, and they were both commenting on the same thing, if you like, from a different point of view, and asking questions and responding to the situation. And I sent it off to Dominic and to Cheryl and to Natalie, and kind of you wait as you do, because it may be rubbish and maybe nothing can be done with it. And they got back and they were very positive and enthusiastic about it. And the thing that really surprised me, and this was a real surprise, was that Cheryl and Natalie in particular, they both said, well, this is the libretto. Like, you say you've written a scenario, but you've actually written something that can be sung. And that was absolutely not something that I was thinking about. I was loosely thinking when I was writing about what in my own head I understood to be musical phrasing, in terms of a kind of natural rhythm of writing, of clauses, of sentences and those kind of things. But it never occurred to me for a second that I was actually writing something that worked. And I remember Natalie said, immediately, she said, this reads like it's meant to be sung. Because I have no background in doing that.
None at all?
None at all, none whatsoever. I have no expertise. So that was just like this complete surprise. What I thought I'd done, I thought I'd written a scenario which somebody else could then take and do something with it. A writer could then take. But in fact, other people were very generous and said, no, we think this is our text. And so from there, we have done workshops that developed things. Maybe because I didn't initially think of the parent's voice. In the first version, the parent's voice wasn't distinctive enough, there wasn't enough depth to the character, if you like, because that was not my first thought. So I had to revisit that, I had to develop that. Then we began to think of the technical onstage things. Who would sing this? How would they sing it? What would it look like? This is a piece which involves going up stairs 14 times. What does that look like on the stage? And we started to sort of have some debate around those. We had a workshop in which we brought in a director who said, well, you could do this with it or you could do that with it, and it was all kind of adding things that certainly I'd not thought about, because I could imagine it on stage, but that's completely different from knowing the nuts and bolts
Yes.
of what direction or design might look like. So what we've been doing since then is trying to work with those details. And I think a big breakthrough came at a relatively recent meeting when we said, what about using puppets?
Oh.
Because there's something that I definitely would have wanted to convey about the physicality of a child with autism and how they move. And in the same way as I taped my son early on, I filmed him doing some of his spinning and twirling and some of his very idiosyncratic movements, and I showed it to Dominic and I showed it to Cheryl and Natalie. And I said, look, this is the kind of thing that happens. This is the kind of thing I'd like to be represented. And I think we all, it would have been too much to ask a 10-year-old boy to both sing, maybe, and to
Yes.
do that. It would have been not just too much to ask. It wouldn't have worked. It would have been too busy. You trying to do that on stage, I think, would have failed. But all of a sudden, when you have puppets, everything's possible with regards to movement and physicality, including. You can probably see yourself, can't you? You can imagine a process of going upstairs becomes dramatically different when conceived of through puppetry than if you actually had to take your parent and your child sort of up a version of stairs. And so that, I think, was a kind of sort of little stroke of genius. It was Dominic's idea, actually. We also had the very first parts of it set to some music. Cheryl came in and she'd done just the opening of the first evening, and Natalie sang it, and it was extraordinary because it's one thing for it to be down, on 6 or 7 pieces of paper, but to hear it and to see and hear the change that immediately happens when it is transformed into song and music was, I just thought, extraordinary, and just immediately turned it into something else entirely.
Bring it to life, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So what do you think has been the most valuable element of these collaborations, and how have they informed your thinking?
For me, the most valuable thing has been to properly engage with and be part of creativity. Because what's happened was, in effect, I mean, I have written books and articles about autism, But when I sat down to write that scenario, I was actually trying to write something that was creative, and to give to people whose day in, day out work is about creativity. And so for me, the access to those creative processes has just been sort of fantastically rewarding. I find quite naturally, probably in a way that would make me a difficult collaborator. Maybe I seem quite sure of where I think things should go, despite not having any track record in creative production. I think the thing, just you'd have to ask them more than me maybe, but the thing that seems to be for others, they seemed really interested in the picture, if you like, that I painted of what it's like for a young person with autism, what it's like to have it, what it looks like, what it sounds like. I think they found that really, really interesting, and possibly something that confounded a few stereotypes and was not necessarily, you don't often see it, you don't often get to understand it in detail. And when I was explaining why somebody with autism might move the way they do, or what might make them happy or sad or fearful, or their sensory responses to different fabrics or things like that, I think this was, for the most part, things they hadn't encountered before or thought through before. And that seemed, or when I made the point about the pleasure of repetition, which was quite, it's very interesting to communicate that to a musician, because of course, you can hit the same note over and over and over and over and over again. And I said that I'm sure I'm not the only person that, in a sort of strange way, sometimes finds that kind of repetition actually rather pleasing. That it's a kind of anti-melody, I suppose, or something. But in order to try and get that idea that repetition, which is so often central to autism, is something where obviously musically there's a way in to discuss, frame, think through what happens with musical repetition and the repetition of phrases and everything. So that was a very natural point. So I think that for each person on the project, maybe that interaction between the kind of the world of autism that I was able to bring to the group and the creativity that they were able to then put around it. For me, that's been by far the most satisfying thing, and because from it emerges something that I think, to go back to where we started, is faithful to the ideas we had at the beginning, is not about sensationalizing or dramatizing or fictionalizing the condition, is trying to treat it with respect and be ethical about how you deal with, which is important, of course, because you're talking about what in many ways is a problematic disability, and turning it into metaphor, which is what tends to happen to autism as well as many other disabilities. They're always rendered metaphorical. That was exactly what we wanted to avoid. We didn't want to say it's a metaphor for something else. It's about being lonely. It's about being isolated. It's about being unable to communicate. That's not what it's about. It's about the manifestations that it makes. How can we capture those manifestations? Not necessarily truthfully, because you want to do it artistically,
yes,
and in terms of a production, but in terms of an artistic production which is faithful to the material on which it draws, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the thin line between artistry and metaphor.
Yes, I mean, metaphor is the big problem, I think, because autism often is seen to be a condition that sort of defies explanation or defies description. It seems very available to be picked up and made into metaphors. And much of the cultural production that does exist about autism, whether it be, say, films or something like that, tends to do that, and it makes it very often sensational as well. I mean, and there is an autism musical, for example, called Autism the Musical, and it's I wouldn't say that one's necessarily too much about metaphors, but it's quite melodramatic in terms of the journey and everything. And I was kind of interested because autism is often not about journeys. It's about not journeying, and that sense of being repetitive sometimes is just an obvious inhibitor to this idea of journey. So I was thinking, well, let's have a story that's not a journey.
Yes.
Other than a nightly journey to bed. And also, I should have mentioned this early, the other thing I wanted to do was which was absolutely key in it not being sensational, was to make it every day, to make it ordinary. Because whilst those who approach it from the outside might feel it to be enigmatic and fascinating, the experience of it on an everyday level is just part and parcel of everyday life. So I thought the business of going to bed is wonderfully everyday, is wonderfully ordinary. So it made for a very good scenario, if you like, to focus on that everyday, ordinary business of bedtime, which all parents who have children go through. And in that way, we'll be trying to explain or show to an audience, if you like, that this is just part and parcel of daily life, and to keep that grounding, to stop the potential for melodrama, if you like.
In a way, that's interesting because opera as an art form has such connotations of melodrama.
Exactly, yes.
So it's interesting that opera is going to be the medium in which you try to communicate something that is so everyday.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I did think about that. But and maybe my naivety around opera was quite useful then, because what I did was, rather than think about it in terms of operatic traditions, I just took the basic building blocks of what we had. Music, song, story, presence on stage. And you find that in their highly seen... The other thing that I kind of love about opera, of course, is it's so fantastically artificial in so many ways, so brilliantly preposterous. And as we all know, there's those great moments where you realise that it's through the seemingly very artificial that you actually get to a wonderful kind of truth-telling.
Yes.
And here seemed an opportunity, and particularly then if you're going to use puppets as well. So our idea is to have the singers on stage with the puppets. So there's never any moment in the whole scheme of this production where realism enters into it at all. And that, of course, is a huge advantage to the attempt to tell a certain kind of truth about the condition, it seems to me, because of the reflection it then requires of anybody listening to it or seeing it. So I think that those basic building blocks of music and song, they lent themselves to the idea that we had about, just to repeat what I said earlier, about this notion of, particularly the notion of the repetition of 14 events, if you like, because you can set a musical phrase which will be the same thing 14 times. You can ask questions of the audience and they'll be going, I've just heard this, why do I want to hear it again? This is exactly the same as I heard 3 minutes or so ago. That whole segment's exactly the same as the last one. You're just pushing people's expectations, maybe even their patience, when you do something like that. And that's entirely the point, really, to ask the question of, how do I experience difference? Because any encounter with disability, for most people, is an encounter with difference. Sometimes encountering autism can be an encounter with quite substantial difference. So I wanted the production, structurally, musically, in the way in which it's framed and developed and on stage, I want it also to be asking those questions about difference, to be putting out to the audience that sense of, are you comfortable with this not being like other things you might have seen? Are you comfortable with it not turning into a journey story? Are you comfortable with the fact that both what you're seeing and what you're hearing is quite like what you've just seen and just heard? That was integral to the idea of it as a production, that it's kind of challenging in that way, while still being, obviously, about something that we might all recognise in terms of a core relationship between a parent and child, and an utterly familiar everyday action of going to bed.
Incredible. So, if money and politics were no object, what would be your vision for sharing thinking on autism and cognitive difference, as you say, in general in the future?
That's kind of a tricky question, I suppose. I was reading somewhere recently that in the last 10 years or so, maybe my dates are not quite right, but over $1 billion has been spent on autism research. And the person who passed on this piece of information, who is himself autistic, said, "And what have we got to show for it?" His point being that the race to do clinical medical research on autism is quite strong. The race to try and understand the genetic causes of autism is one that's occupying an awful lot of minds. But his point is that surely what's most important is making the lives of those with autism as good as they can be. And if you implicitly he's saying, what if you'd taken that $1 billion and spent it on care, and spent it on structured support for people? So when you ask me that question, money and politics not being an issue, my first thought is to provide better services. This is a very kind of nuts and bolts answer to your question in one way, but it's the first thing that pops into one's head, to provide better services. That much said, I do think the history of representation of autism has largely been a history of misrepresentation. The classic example is that there are still many, many people who believe that if you are autistic, you necessarily have special skills, or you necessarily have savant skills.
Yeah.
That you're good at maths or memory or calculation or music in many cases. And that is entirely a cultural narrative. It goes back to Barry Levinson's film Rain Man from the 1980s, in which that's a central part of Dustin Hoffman's character. That representation became so embedded in the sort of cultural consciousness of particularly kind of, the Western apprehensions of what autism is, that it became seen as a kind of fact. So I would like there to be more opportunities to tell stories about autism that are, in as much as one can do this, not misrepresentations, that are faithful to the multiple stories autism can tell. I'd like there to be more opportunity to have those stories told by people with autism, to have those stories commented on by people with autism, as opposed to the usual kind of silencing that goes on of those who are disabled. I'd like the possibility of more listening, further listening if you like, to those who have the condition, and that from all of that could come an understanding that, like a lot of conditions of disability, these are not things that are only associated with negatives, with absence, with lack, with loss, with deficit. The standard definitions of autism that you'll read, say, in medical textbooks, will tend to orient around what people can't do, cannot communicate this, have problems doing that, have not developed language or something. It's a deficit model of identity, if you like. I like the idea that, without denying what difficulties may come with the condition for some people, not for everyone, of course, and their families in some cases, that you might also turn around and say, well, this is what people with autism can do, as opposed to what they can't do. This is what it can look like. This is the insight it can bring. I'd hope that in a small way, the production is kind of part of that process. It's about looking anew, if you like, the possibility of giving a second thought to a condition or a person who you might think only functions in a certain kind of way. They have something else to say which you might not have heard. So in an ideal world, I'd like it all wraps together, doesn't it? To basically say more voices being heard, a greater fidelity to the nature of the condition and the way it does express itself, not always seeing it as being problematic or as being a deficit, and seeing the ways in which it actually enhances our understanding of everything around us as opposed to just problematizing it.
Thank you very much.